Welcome to the TEFL Training Institute podcast. In July 2005, after a 13-hour flight, I arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. I was tired, I was hungry. My relative who was supposed to meet at the airport was very busy, so I had to take the public transport around rush hour, 6 p.m., to find the place where I stay. So I was trying to talk to local people and ask for directions to find the place where I was supposed to stay, but I couldn't open my mouth and I couldn't think of any words I learned.
So why was that, Tracy? What happened?
Because I was exhausted, I was hungry. So at that point, my physical needs took over my mental ability. So at that point, I wanted food and a place to lie down and rest. So that's why I wasn't able to remember anything. But the second day, I felt much better, relaxed, and I feel, the French words I learned gradually came back to my mind. And I could say hello and how are you and ask directions.
Today we're going to look at how does stress affect students and their language production in our classes.
And we're going to look at a couple of questions. And the first one, how does the stress affect the student's performance in the class? And the second one, how can teachers avoid overloading the students? And the third one is, how can we balance the stress level and also at the same time challenge the students in the class? So Ross, do you have any example or something that experience and how the stress level affects the student performance in the class?
A couple of months ago, I had to teach a class and I did something where I got students to write a simple recipe and then I sent them a recipe onto their phones, which should have been for the same meal as they'd written the recipe for. And then I got the students to compare the two recipes, then try to get the students to find any new words that they weren't familiar with and then try and deduce the meaning of those new words. But I found it really didn't work very well at all because there was a lot of new language that they weren't prepared for. And I also think this type of activity, which was writing something and comparing your work to something authentic, a little bit of a task-based cycle, was something the students were completely unfamiliar with. So it just proved to be way too much for them. And people seem to get demotivated very quickly.
So that just reminds me of the high and low stress level of content and high and low stress methods or activity. So for example, the high stress content and basically you put the learners on the spot emotionally or intellectually.
So for my example, I guess they were put on the spot intellectually.
Yes, and the low stress content, something is quite easy for them to complete, like watch a video or maybe talk to your partner, something they're familiar with.
So tell me about the emotionally thing then. Is this if you get the students to debate something they feel really passionate about, then this would be high stress content?
Yeah, or maybe something is a bit sensitive.
Yeah, or just opinions about something that are important to the students. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to be aware of it. You don't want students being highly emotional.
Which is interesting, right? Because I think we normally do want students to be not emotional. We say we want students to be engaged.
Mm-hmm.
I was speaking to another observer recently from Trinity, and he was talking about observing a class. And he said, the students in the final activity were too engaged. And I was like, what do you mean by too engaged? I always thought like engagement, it was like the more engaged you were, the better. But he was saying that the students were so engaged in this activity that they just stopped speaking English and they reverted back to their first language and they started speaking Chinese because I guess the content became so important to them and it was so important for them to say their opinion. I think it was about movies or film stars or something that took over wanting to speak the language. So he was saying that you don't want students to be bored, but you don't want students to be so engaged that the language just doesn't matter to them anymore.
Yeah.
So do you have a couple of examples of activities in those different quadrants, Tracy?
Okay. If it's low stress content and low stress activity, I would say it's a little bit boring. But I think it's okay to start with your lesson with like a low stress content, low stress activity, because learners are so easy to complete it and build up their confidence.
Yeah.
And then
what about the opposite? Something that's high stress content and high stress activity.
That's terrifying. Like your recipe class, maybe that was terrifying for your learners because we need them to be emotionally and intellectually prepared to complete the task. So as a teacher, we always want to try our best to develop our students and give them as much as possible. But the problem is we sometimes overload the students. So Ross, how can we avoid overloading them?
The best metaphor I heard for this was to think of people's brains being like mobile phones or like computers. So, if you have your phone and you have lots and lots of apps all running at the same time, then the apps run a lot slower.
Yeah, that sounds like my mobile phone.
But if you only have one app running at any one time, then the app probably runs okay. So it's kind of like that with the brain as well. That if you give, for example, someone lots of things to do at the same time, then it's unlikely that they'll be able to do all those things to a high standard. So, for example, if you have speaking new language, that's kind of difficult for people. That requires a lot of processing power in their brain. So maybe we can do that. If that's the only thing that we're doing, that's fine. But if you add to that like another complex activity, like you're using that language to debate with other students about how to solve global warming, well, that also requires this cognitive ability of thinking of solutions, weighing up potential possibilities, and then maybe you add on to that different roles in the group, which makes it more complex, and maybe there's an amount of money that you can have to spend. So if you add all of these things together, then the students, they might still be able to do the activity, but the level of language they'll produce will be lower because the language producing app in the brain will run slower because there's all these other apps running at the same time.
Oh, okay. Is this something that you mentioned before about the lows?
Yeah, so another similar way of looking at this is these 4 loads. So cognitive loads, cultural loads, language loads, and learning loads. So the idea is that you want to sort of avoid having all of these being high at the same time for students.
Yeah. So you talk about the cognitive and language and learning loads just now. So do you mind to give us more information about the cultural?
So I guess a cultural load might be if what you're doing in the class is something that's completely new to the students as a cultural concept. So for example, if you gave to a bunch of students in China, you have to plan a Halloween party. If you've never been to a Halloween party or you don't know what it's like, that becomes a lot more difficult for your students to learn or to understand.
Yeah, okay, I definitely had the experience before. And you were trying to focus on the activity, but you spend more time to explain what it is.
Right. So that's not to say you can never talk about or things that are culturally unfamiliar to your students in class. You can, but if you do that, you have to make sure that the cognitive load is a lot lower, or maybe you expect them to use less new language when they're discussing this.
Okay. It just reminds me of my training with new teachers. We do training the second and the third day after they arrive at a new city and new country. So it gave quite a lot information how to live in this country and how to survive, about health and safety. They're in the situation is really high stress situation because they have no idea what's going on. They had jet lag, and also the information we gave them was really high level of content. So not only teaching and also training, and we should consider that as well.
Yeah, or even just in terms of what you were saying about the volume, right? It's not something like we can only get, I think, 7 new items into our working memory at any one time. So if one of those items is like a new cultural concept, then that means that's another thing that you can't get in for a new word. Or if it's training for teachers, if you've given people lots of information about how to find an apartment in their new city, and they're trying to remember all that, they're not going to be able to remember lots and lots of new information about the teaching methods of the school that they've been given a job in. So Tracy, we don't want to overload our students, but obviously students sometimes complain that they don't learn anything new or that things are too easy for them. So how can we make sure that students are not stressed but still get challenged?
I think during the lesson preparation, I think teacher don't have to completely change either the activity or task they prepared. Have you ever heard of the pyramid?
What's the
In terms of
pyramid?
the students' interaction patterns?
Tell us.
So at the bottom of the pyramid, and just like mingle and group work, and more students can figure out something together, and then move up to the middle part and small group or pair work, and to the top is individual work. So I was thinking, like, if your activity or task is really high stress level of content, and you need to make sure you start from the bottom of the student interactive pattern. You know what I mean? For example, your recipe thing.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of ask students to do the task individually, and you can put them into groups, and maybe each students can read the recipe by themselves and then focus on the different lines, and then they can exchange information. Or before that, you can ask group to write a recipe together instead of individual piece of work.
To me, I think it also like kind of depends on them going through this pyramid in terms of preparing for something. So if they're preparing for individual work, then definitely doing what you said, first of all, and getting students to maybe mingle first to get other ideas, and then get feedback from pairs, and then finally writing something themselves is a good way of making that something that looks initially terrifying, getting lots of help and feedback, and eventually producing something. But then equally the opposite's true. I think if it's an interactive activity and you've got students who need to speak to each other, so if it's like a whole class debate, maybe the first thing you could do is get students to write down their thoughts individually, and then pair work, going down the pyramid, you share what you thought with your partner and they give you some feedback, and then finally do the whole class activity. And by that point, people don't feel it's terrifying anymore because they've prepared by themselves, they've had some feedback from a peer, and then they feel ready to produce that in front of the whole group. So I think it kind of depends on what the outcome is, but I think you can definitely go either from the bottom to the top of the if it's something that's individual, then you start off with group work, and if it's something that you want to be speaking to the whole class at the end, then you can start individually and work that.
Yeah, exactly. If you'd like to listen to more podcasts, please check our website www.tafeltraininginstitute.com.